Hey, what is up guys, and welcome back to another video, and in this video we are going to be continuing on with our not our C Sharp, but our Swift tutorials. I'm so used to being in our C Sharp videos, but we're going to be continuing on with our Swift series, and in this particular tutorial we are going to be taking a look at optionals. We're taking a bit of a step back, but that's fine because when we start looking at inheritance and polymorphism in the next video, we're going to need to know kind of what optionals are. So we're going to take a look at them now. What are optionals then? Well, optionals is a feature in Swift to allow for more type safety. It allows an object or a variable to be nil. Now, if you're familiar with something like Java or C Sharp, nil may not sound exactly familiar, but you will have heard of null, and null and nil are the same thing, but in Swift we use nil, not null, okay? Nil is the absence of a value. Let's say in Xcode we have an optional int called x. Well, how do we create that optional int? Well, to do that, we can say var x colon int question mark equals, and let's set it to nil. Now that works. To create an optional, you have to append a question mark to the end of your type. Now, the only way that Swift will be able to infer that your variable is an optional is if the value by default is nil. Okay? But technically speaking, most of the time, you don't know what the value is going to be initially. So, if you think it might be nil at any point in your code, make sure you mark the variable with a type annotation that includes a question mark as its suffix. That way, you can account for any nil values later on. Now, if you have a nil, or you have an optional rather, in say a function or anywhere else, you can't just use the value on its own. So you can't just go and say, you can't just, like let's say you want to pass x to a function that takes in a non-optional int. Well, you can't just do that. If you want to pass x to a function that takes in a non-optional int or just a non-optional in general, you need to do what's called unwrapping. There are many ways of unwrapping an optional, and those ways are using a guard let statement, using an if let statement, or force unwrapping, as well as nil coalescing. So let's take a look at what exactly those mean. Okay? Well, to do this, we can say in our code, we can say func add or rather func, we can say cube. This will take in an int, so we'll call it x. And this will be a non-optional int. So this int x as our parameter needs to have a value. It must have a value. X cannot be nil as a parameter. Well, we can return x times x times x, like that. If we want to call this function, so cube, we say x and we pass in x, what happens? Well, Xcode goes and gives us an error. And it tells us that value of optional type int must be unwrapped. So we have to unwrap this integer first. We have to unwrap x. Now let's do do this all the different ways that we can, starting with nil coalescing. Inside of our function, where we have x being passed to the cube function, we can say x space question mark, and give it a 0 or some other value. Now, what does that mean here? Well, we're saying pass in the value of x if and only if it's not nil. If x is nil, pass 0 instead. All right. Now we can say var result equals cube and print result. Save it, run it, and our build succeeds, and we get 0. Why do we get 0? Well, because x is initially nil. Let's go ahead and change x instead of nil, we are going to say 3. Okay, so now that we have an actual value here, when we save it and we run it, the x is no longer nil, so it will just pass in the 3 that we have our the value set to here. So 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. And we get 27 printed. Pretty simple. All right. Let's change this back to nil. All right. What we can do now is we can now let's go ahead and get rid of our, let's see, result equals our result equals cube. There. We're going to just pass x into cube. We're going to get an error because x is an optional and that needs to be unwrapped. But what we can do now is we're going to use the if-let syntax. All right. So actually, let's get rid of all of our code. And we'll say var x colon int question mark equals nil. Here, we can again say func cube x int return x times x times x. We can say now if let x equals x. And what this is saying is if x is not nil, assign the value of x to this new sort of local x to our if statement, and this x for if let x can only be accessed within our if let statement. So if our optional x is not optional, assign the non-nil value to the non-optional version of x in our if let. That's all that means there. Here, we can then say var result equals cube x colon x, like that. And then we can do an else. So if x is optional, we can say print unfortunately x is nil, so we can't do anything with it. Okay, if we go ahead and run our code, we get a build failed. Why did we get a build failed? Let's take a look. Okay. So okay, I see what I did wrong here. I forgot to define the return type, int. There we go. Now, we can then say print result, save, run, and now we have build succeeded. Because x is nil, we are getting, unfortunately, x is nil, so we can't do anything with it. But if instead of nil, it's set to, let's say, 2, and we run it, now, because x no longer is nil, we are actually executing our cube function, and we get the result of 8 printed to our console, because 2 cubed is 8. Now, in this kind of scenario, the if let is probably your best bet. Okay? And the reason why is because in this sort of scenario where you want to make sure that you aren't calling cube in a context where we're passing it any kind of optional value. You could do what's called force unwrapping, but that's generally not recommended here, and I'm not showing you that method yet of unwrapping an optional. Just know that here the safest way is using an if-let. Now, you could also unwrap an optional using a guard-let statement. Let's say that we have a method where it could return optional. It could return nil. It could return a non-nil value. We don't know. We just know it returns an optional type, and we want to be able to. We want to do something only if the return is not nil. If it is nil, we just want to return get out of the function we're in. So let's say we have a func do something and this will return an optional int, let's say. And we'll just return nil for now. Okay? Well, what we can do is then we can also have a func, we'll say do something to. This won't return anything. Okay? And we want to get the result of the do something method and unwrap it and try to unwrap it if it has a non-nil value. That's where a guard let comes in. To do that, we can say guard let, let's say result equals do something. Then we need to provide an else condition. So we need to provide what will happen if it doesn't unwrap, if it's not a non-nil value. So else, we just want to return, do nothing. So get out of the function, do nothing, because we don't want to do anything else beyond this point. No, I don't want that. We just want return. All right. Now, we can say print result. All right. So now, this do something to method is first attempting to unwrap the result of do something, which is an optional int. If it cannot unwrap it, if the result of do something is nil, then we will just return. We'll get out of this function because we don't want to do anything else beyond this point if it's nil, because we can't. If it does not a nil value and we can unwrap it, we store that non-nil value into result, which is in this case a non-optional int. We can then print out that result. And we can do this by saying do something to. Save it, run it, and you can see nothing happened. That's because we just returned out of the method. Do something returns nil on its own. So let's change nil to, let's say, 5. So return 5. Save, run the code again, and now we get 5 printed to the console because result is now 5 when do something actually returns a value other than nil. Okay, so that is guard let. So far we've taken a look at nil coalescing, if let, and guard let. Now there is another way of unwrapping an optional, and it's not really recommended, but you can do it. And that is to force unwrap the optional. This can be very dangerous. Why can force unwrapping the optional be dangerous? Well, force unwrapping it can be dangerous because, for all you know, when you're trying to force unwrap it, the value could be nil, in which case your program will crash because you can't force nil onto a non-optional type. It's going to crash otherwise. I'll show you what that looks like here in a moment. So let's go ahead. In Xcode, we're going to have int x. We're going to set it equal to nil. This is going to be a string, right? Okay. Xcode is being uncooperative. We're going to say var x string question mark equals nil. Okay, so we have an optional string called x. This x is now we're going to try to pass this x into a function. And we'll say function, or func rather. We'll say log message string. And this will print message. Okay? Pretty simple method right now. We can then try to call log message, and we just try to pass x. Now, Xcode will yell at us. It'll give us an error saying, hey, x needs to be unwrapped. We can say, fine, okay. But right after x, try to unwrap it. And that is going to be with an exclamation point. Now you can see the error goes away. But when we try to run it, it builds, it runs, but our application crashed. Why is that? Well, because our log method takes in a string. This string is not an optional string. And because our optional string x that we're trying to pass into log is an optional string and its value is nil, we're trying to force nil onto a non-optional type, which isn't going to work and is going to cause our code to crash on runtime. So we can go ahead and change the value assigned to x if my screen reader will cooperate with me. We can change it from nil to this is some message, like that. So it's not a nil value. We can run it. Just hit replace. We can see build succeeded, and we get our little message printed out into the console, and it exits with a 0 exit code, just as we would have expected it to. And because now that we have an actual string value assigned to our optional string, we're not trying to force a nil value onto a non-nil type. So it works just fine now. But that is why force unwrapping is not very safe. Although you can do it, it's not recommended because it's not very safe in the slightest. You have to be very, very careful. And that's why guard let, if let, nil coalescing, and stuff like that are generally recommended over force unwrapping. So that pretty much does it on this video for optionals, guys. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.